Good morning, West Contra Costa Unified School Community. Thank you so much for joining us this first Friday of October. I want to thank you for your incredible, passionate, dedicated work so far this year and for your really full and engaging participation in this work that we've done together in September. Today, we start our very first session of our October series around race and equity in our school district. Today's session will be dedicated to race and education, the history of racism in public education. We're going to have a chance to hear from Millie Burns, who's a consultant who works with us and has worked with us for a number of years, helping to create more restorative environments in our district. We're going to get a chance to hear from Michael Hatcher, who's one of our fantastic assistant principals at Richmond High School. We're also going to get a chance to hear briefly from LaShante Smith. We'll go for about 60 minutes today, maybe a little bit less, and we'll have 30 minutes for you to digest and do some sense making back at your sites or your departments with your site and department leaders. Before we start, I wanted to share, many of you may have seen an email that I sent last night regarding an unfortunate incident that occurred in our district. Sad to say, we were witness to an incident that occurred where a member of one of our union representatives used inappropriate racial language, and I put out a statement to make sure everybody in our community knew that that is not something we accept or condone. It also makes clear why we need to continue to do this work together, to continue to deepen our understanding of race, bias, racism in our country, and the work that we need to do internally with ourselves to really look at our own biases, our own assumptions. So while the note I sent last night was unfortunate, it's timely that we get a chance to dig into these issues together with each other. So if we can move to our first slide to talk about our outcomes for the day, that would be helpful. Great. Could we move to our next slide, please? Thank you. So as we mentioned last month, our goals for this work that we're doing together are to create spaces for education and reflection about our own behavior, our own biases, and our hopes for change. To create a space for safe, trusting, and productive conversations among our staff, to learn more about racism, white supremacy culture, implicit bias, and other relevant topics, to identify site and district patterns and outcomes that need to be addressed and improved, to end any racist behavior in the district, and dismantle policies that contribute to racist behavior and unjust outcomes, and to ensure that African American youth are supported and empowered in every way. These are our year-long goals, and this is the work we will do together. I am now going to ask LaShante Smith to introduce a little bit more of today's very specific session.
Thank you. So we've been meeting as a planning group to really think about how to address this very important issue across our district. So for today, we thought we would start with an objective of beginning to understand and build awareness of the racist history of Black education in public school in the United States. We thought this was very important because it will give all of us a historical framework, and it will also lay out a foundation for how the education system was not created to serve all of our children. So for today, we're going to walk through some hard historical truths. We're going to discuss the Brown versus Board of Education Act. We're then going to go into a discussion about after Brown, what Brown actually did. And then you're going to have time to talk at your sites around what you heard today and engage in further discussion. So I'll turn it over to Millie, who will begin with the hard historical truths.
Thanks, LaShante. As Matt said, I'm Millie Burns. I'm a consultant with the district. I'm also a past district parent, so this work is important. I'm just going to run through very quickly some of the salient points in the history of education as it pertains to Black people. Then we'll see a video, and Mr. Hatcher will deliver a real thorough explanation for us. So, in short, the United States is the only country known to actually have outlawed and prohibited the education of people who are enslaved. As the next slide will indicate, and let's change slides. People had a very good reason for doing this. It was really understood that education creates opportunities, it creates choices, it creates hope. Education allows people to look toward a better life. That doesn't work if you want to keep people enslaved. It was understood that in order to keep slaves passive and acceptance of their condition, they needed to be kept in a state of ignorance and degradation. Next slide, please. There were those abolitionists who did try to address this primarily in northern states by creating what they called free Black schools. And then certainly post in the Reconstruction period, there were other attempts. But by and large, we progressively moved towards making education, especially teaching slaves to read. Let's move to the next slide, please. Illegal. Okay. During the Reconstruction period, there were real efforts to promote free public school education. This wasn't the first time, by the way. Thomas Jefferson tried to get people to put in free public school education, but there was a lot of pushback as people were afraid of taxation. He created tax-supported schools, and of course, the racial prejudice, the desire not to empower African Americans. But as Southern states and many state constitutions did guarantee free public education, in reality, white children, particularly poor white children, benefited more than Black children. Next slide. And that brings us up to our beloved Plessy versus Ferguson. The state of Louisiana had been sued, and it was questioned whether they had the right to segregate railroad cars. When the decision came down that said, yes, indeed, separate but equal was okay, it in fact made segregation legal. And so as a result, we began to see Southern states pass laws requiring segregation in schools. By, 17 states actually began to have legal segregation, while the rest of our states had de facto segregation. Next slide. And that brings us up to Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And in that landmark case, which we're going to hear more about for the rest of this session, the Supreme Court agreed that segregated schools were inherently unequal and should be abolished. Mr. Hatcher is going to talk more about the impact of that. So I'm going to leave that one alone for now. Let's go to the next slide, which simply mentions one of many incidents in which states, particularly southern states, resisted the Brown decision. In Little Rock, Arkansas, and I personally remember this, that's how old I am, the governor of Arkansas sent his National Guard to actually prevent African American students from enrolling in the local high school. The president at the time did send troops to enforce the court order, but it was not because he was opposed to desegregation. It was because he couldn't let a state governor defy the federal government and the Supreme Court in that way. And so with that, let's look at a video in which Linda Brown, whose family was the core plaintiff in Brown versus the Board of Education, actually talks about her experience. Thanks a lot, guys. Let's key up the video, please.
Child to bear. I can still remember taking that bitter walk and the terrible cold that would cause my tears to freeze upon my face. I would return home running as fast as I could. I had to cross a very busy avenue in order to catch the school bus, which would carry me 2 miles across town to the all-black Monroe School. These were the circumstances which so angered Black parents. My father pondered, why? Why should we have to tell our children that they cannot go to their school in their neighborhood because their skin is Black? Why? Why must I have to spend time trying to explain to my child that she cannot go to school with her neighborhood playmates who are predominantly white, Native American, Hispanic, and Asian because her skin is Black? In the face of this discouragement, he, along with 12 other parents, met with the local NAACP and their lawyer, Charles S. Scott, a local attorney, to make plans for each family to try and enroll their child in the white school nearest their home during September 1950. After trying enrollment and being turned down, a suit was filed in federal court in February of 1951. During the following July, the federal 3-judge panel heard testimony from my father, along with several of the other parents who agreed that segregated schools for Blacks were unequal. I, along with my father, had to appear in court, but unlike him, I was never asked to appear on the witness stand. The case was argued before a 3-judge federal court in Topeka and was decided in favor of the Board of Education and its segregated elementary schools. In Topeka, the issue was not so much integrating public schools to improve the quality of instruction, but rather the inaccessibility of the neighborhood schools. Black people were able to live all over town, but could not expect to send their children to the schools closest to their home. As for the quality of instruction, we have to pay our respects to the educators of the 50s. And I must say, those teachers were wonderful. They wanted you to learn, and you would learn under them. But it wasn't only Monday through Friday when you saw those teachers. You also saw them at the grocery store on Saturday, and you saw them at church on Sunday. And they still expected you to be that exemplary student. During the local court battle, there was a very definite division within the Black community. There were those who felt this action was long overdue, and those who expressed concern about upsetting the balance of things which they feared could lead to job loss and threats of violence. The local school board, which somehow believed itself to be above reproach, mailed threatening letters to the Black teachers, the most well-known of which stated, and I quote, "Dear Miss Buchanan, due to the present uncertainty about enrollment next year in schools for Negro children, it is not possible at this time to offer you employment for next year. If the court should rule that segregation in the elementary grades is unconstitutional, our board will proceed on the assumption that the majority of people in Topeka will not want to employ Negro teachers next year for white children. It is necessary for me to notify you now that your services will not be needed for next year. This is in compliance with the continuing contract law. If it turns out that segregation is not terminated, there will be nothing to prevent us from negotiating a contract with you at some later date this spring. You will understand that I am sending letters of this kind to only those teachers of the Negro schools who have been employed during the last year or two. It is presumed that even though segregation should be declared unconstitutional, we would have need for some schools for Negro children, and we would retain our Negro teachers to teach them. I think I understand that all of you must be under considerable strain, and I sympathize with the uncertainties and inconvenience which you must be experiencing during this period of adjustment. I believe that whatever happens will ultimately turn out to be the best for everyone concerned. Sincerely yours, Wendell Godwin, Superintendent of Schools.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you, sir. So I'm Michael Hatcher. I'll be doing a 5-minute summary of the importance of the Brown v. Board. So in the interest of this being sit and get, I'm going to read to you. Usually with the presentation, we don't do that, but I'm going to do that. So this quote is, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. President Lyndon B. Johnson. We will return to this slide later, and hopefully it'll make a lot more sense. Can we go to the next slide, please? So why are we doing this work? we need to confront the history of racism in American education because we need a lens to understand how is it a country which claims to prize equality, right? We say we're a meritocracy and we have all these opportunities. How can they explain and accommodate the persistent marginalization of people? Next slide, please. Right. Marginalization happens consistently in at least two ways. And we're going to look at race and class today. So can we go to the next slide? When it comes to race, the United States has a caste system where Blacks and Native Americans are easily at the bottom. With regards to Blacks, at the end of the antebellum period, literacy was seen as liberation. Now, this doesn't mean that like Black people were sitting around saying, you know what, I really wish I could read Proust. Or, you know, if I could read Melville, my life would be so much better. What literacy for liberation really meant was this country is a republic and it's based on laws. And access to those laws would give Black people the ability to stop the kidnapping, torture, murder, and rape that they were subjected to. That was the belief. And so literacy was seen literally as liberation. This was vehemently opposed by Southern and Northern whites. Can we go to the next slide, please? So where Blacks saw education as a path to self-empowerment and self-determination, Northern and Southern whites really got together and saw education of Blacks in particular as a path to disenfranchisement. Black people were not expected to have political office or vote, social inefficiency, being prepared to do the most menial jobs in society, and solidify a racial caste system. So that means making sure that Black people accepted their place or their lot in life. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when it comes to class, prior to Brown versus Board, universal education was not conceived of as transforming social classes. Universal education was not seen as a way for anyone to pull themselves out of any situation that they were in. Next slide, please. Right. Universal education was expected to create a functional society through democratic participation, right? We'll teach you how to vote, we'll teach you how to participate, and social efficiency. We'll teach you skills so you can participate in the market, that you can have a job and help make the society more efficient. But it wasn't seen as a lens to getting people into a better position. It was initially opposed by landed Southern whites who preferred older, cruder means of socialization and control, and was only accepted as Southern labor saw the progress that was made by Blacks. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So Brown versus Board really was the pivoting point where there was a confrontation between the system of self-empowerment and self-determination that Black people had created for themselves and the system of universal education, out of which this idea of social mobility was born. All right, next slide. So social mobility is basically the idea that individuals or families or households can move their station. Like you can move from the lower class to the middle class or from the middle class to the higher class. You could change your strata. Thank you. Right. Which brings us back to the quote by Lyndon Johnson. Right. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. Right. Brown v. Board put everybody in the same place at the same time. The narrative had been, hey, white people, you're a lot better than these Black people. White people are asking, hey, if they're in my school, how can I be better than them? Next slide, please. So at this intersection, American education took a turn. When it came to class, the notion that we had to have some kind of democratic equality was born. People had to learn to participate functionally in this society. They had to learn to participate as politicians and they had to learn to function as voters. There had to be social efficiency. People had to learn skills that they could take with them when they move from one place to the next. And there had to be social mobility. You had to be able to change your station. Education had to offer something that it didn't offer before. But at the same time, as Blacks integrated into schools, the earlier ideas they had of self-empowerment and self-determination went away, and the earlier ideas that Northern and Southern whites had caught on. Disenfranchisement, social immobility, and solidify a racial caste system. Next slide, please. So if this flies in the face of your understanding of public education and or the meritocratic nature of schools, ask yourself two questions. How did 30% of a population get to determine the next 30% who will be socially mobile, right? And the other question we have to ask ourselves, if you look at the data anywhere in the country, Black students are perpetually disenfranchised, marginalized, and expected to remain in their place in schools. On the next slide, I have my citations. So if anybody gets a chance to look at these slides, you can go ahead and read these books for yourselves and kind of start to grapple with these ideas. And then finally, we go one more slide, please. This podcast, Ms. Buchanan's Period of Adjustment, goes more into depth about the outcomes from Brown. I thank you for your time today, appreciate you, and hopefully we get this work done. Is that it? When's the tour bus coming around? Sorry, that's a joke.
Want to announce site.
Thank you, everybody. I know that was a pretty express history of race and schooling, but we wanted to make sure that the salient points were captured, the ability to see that video. We know we're ending a little bit earlier than we expected to this afternoon. So we are going to have you return back to your sites and departments. Encourage you, if you can, to listen to the podcast that is in both this deck and the lesson plan that we sent to our site leaders and department leaders. We've also sent a few follow-up questions to help you frame a discussion that you can have at your sites to talk a little bit about this presentation. The deck will be available, so we'll make sure you all have that and have access to it. So take a few-minute break, head back to your sites and departments. We wish you well with having some debrief conversation from this time and really thinking about sort of the history of race and the history of race in schools and how that shaped us to be where we are today, and thinking about some of the things that we need to do. So thank you, Millie. Thank you, Mike. And we will see you all next week. Enjoy the conversations. Hope they're healthy and productive. And happy Friday. Thank you.